this day feels heavy. 16 December is usually that day, but today feels heavier than other 16 Decembers. We have gathered here to mourn, also to reflect and remember, and to honor the memory of those and the lives of those who suffered from the catastrophe that was 1971. Beginning, of course, from the people of Bangladesh. This won't be your usual academic and scholarly discussion, as it were. We're not really interested in charting the political history of 1971. That is well-trodden ground anyway. We're not interested in the Yaya, the Bhuttos, the Najibs. We are interested instead in the question of suffering and what Yasmin Saikia called in her book, Insaniyat, the book that is titled Women, War, and the Making of Bangladesh. She was meant to be here, actually, in December, alongside other scholars, Pakistani, Indian, and Bangladeshi. 16 December, actually, today was supposed to mark the second chapter of a two-part conference, the first part of which was meant to be, was meant to happen really in March 71 to coincide with the launching of the military operation in East Pakistan and with the declaration of independence from Pakistan on part of Sheikh Mujib. That didn't happen. We all know that. It was cancelled, as you all know, after both the university and organizers, I was amongst them, received threats from the Ministry of Agriculture. So those days were heavy too, of course, and they were heavy not simply because we agonized endlessly about what we could and perhaps should have done differently, but those days were heavy also because we were ashamed, because we had Bangladeshi colleagues, we didn't know what to say to them. This was actually one of the first occasions when Bangladeshi scholars had agreed to share the same platform with the Pakistani counterparts. There had been earlier attempts before, and there are all kinds of stories about what happened. Didn't quite work out, including, by the way, a Bangladeshi scholar who was invited to Pakistan in 2011. That was the 40th anniversary of the War of Liberation, and she shows up outside the Pakistani consulate, and she refuses to go in. It was too much for her to, in some ways, imagine. And so our conference in March, it was, from our perspective, it was important, first of all, obviously, to acknowledge our positionality as Pakistani academics speaking about 1971 in a Pakistani institution. It was important to acknowledge, of course, how the war was remembered and commemorated by Bangladesh as a war of liberation. It was important, of course, to acknowledge their suffering and our complicity. It was important to move beyond Pakistani, Indian, and Bangladeshi statist and nationalist narratives. But ultimately, from our perspective, it was important to think about reconciliation. And for us, the condition for reconciliation was truth and truth-telling, even if it is, of course, a truth that hurts, as truths often do. That, at least, is what we learned from TRCs that have been convened the world over. And so we are gathered in that spirit here again today. Beaten, yes, but hopefully not defeated. And as small as this may seem, and it is small, it is still an affirmation of and an insistence on truth-telling. And so, which is especially important, I would add, given that this month has been marked by the release of documentaries and telefilms and drama serials, all of which, of course, seek to convey a very specific memory of 1971. Our speakers today will each in their own way reflect on the loss and the calamity that was 1971, and I'm delighted to introduce them. I will start, actually, with Hafsa Khawaja. She is a teaching fellow at our school. She teaches Pakistan Studies. And what gives me special joy, and it's a deep honor for me, is also to introduce her as our former student. She went on to complete her degree sadly not in history, but nevertheless she completed a degree with much distinction and fanfare in 2018, and then went on to Columbia as a Fulbright scholar, and where she did her MA thesis on the violence of 1971. I'm also pleased to introduce Sara Kazmi. She is finishing up her PhD at Cambridge in post-colonial literature. So her dissertation is on Punjabi poetry, post-colonial Punjabi poetry, I beg your pardon, from India and Pakistan, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at our school. Next, I would like to introduce Anam Zakaria. She's a writer, a historian, an educationist. She was affiliated with the Citizens Archive. And she has, I just want to flag 2 books that received great acclaim. She has other publications as well. But the first book, The Footprints of Partition, Narratives of 4 Generations, award-winning book, that came out in 2016, I believe. 15, yeah. And the second book that I want to flag is A People's History, 1971, A People's History from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. And finally, we have Taimoor Shahid. He is a poet, he is a translator, he has translated, The Madness of Waiting, and he is a doctoral student finishing up his PhD at the University of Chicago, and his thesis is on the poem, the epic called Settle Buru. And Taimoor Shahid, I am Ali Raza. I should have started with that. Historian at the Burmani School. I shall be moderating the session, and I will hand over the floor, at least for now, to Taimoor Shahid, who will start with a diary entry in March 1971.
पद्मा सुर्ख है। 1971 में होने वाली बांग्लादेश की जंग आज़ादी की एक डायरी से इक़्तिबास। 28 मार्च 1971। लाउड स्पीकर की चीखों पुकार ने चौंकाकर नींद से उठा दिया। एक आवाज़ कह रही थी कि कर्फ्यू जो सुबह 7 बजे ख़त्म होने वाला था ताहुक्म सानी जारी रहेगा। उसके थोड़ी ही देर बाद तड़ 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 गोलियां चलने की आवाज़ करीब ही सुनाई दी। सब उठकर बाहर देखने लगे, लेकिन कुछ मालूम ना हो सका। बच्चों के चेहरे खौफ से सफ़ेद हो गए। उसके बाद तो यके बाद दीगरे फायर और जवाबी फायर की आवाज़ें आने लगीं। अचानक एक धमाके ने ज़मीन को हिला दिया। दिल से आवाज़ निकली, या अल्लाह खैर। अंदाज़ा था कि आदमी पुलिस पर गोलाबारी कर रही है। उसके बाद हर धमाके पर दिल बैठ सा जाता। मुतवातिर ऑटोमेटिक फायर के अलावा एक गहरे फायर की भी आवाज़ आ रही थी, जिससे जाहिर होता था कि बाकायदा लड़ाई हो रही है। दिल में हज़ारों किस्म के सवाल उठ रहे थे। दोपहर को माली ताहिर खबर लाया कि पुलिस लाइन की तरफ से धुआं उठ रहा है। इमदाद की छोटी बहन बहुत घबरा गई थी। मैंने इसे बहलाने के लिए लूडो में लगा लिया। थोड़ी देर बाद ताहिर फिर खबर लाया कि ईपीआर ने आर्मी पर हमला कर दिया है। अक्सर गाड़ियां ख़त्म कर दी हैं और ईपीआर तो तोप भी इस्तेमाल कर रही है, लेकिन किसी को यकीन नहीं आया। हम लोग सब कुछ भूलकर रंग खेलने लगे ताकि सबका दिल बहला रहे। लेकिन ठीक उस वक्त देखा कि सामने के महल्ले वाले सब भाग रहे हैं। पूछा तो मालूम हुआ कि मिलिट्री घरों को आग लगाती इस तरफ आ रही है। यह खबर सुनकर बड़ी परेशानी हुई। ये नाजुक लम्हा था। चचा जान भी घबरा गए। कहने लगे, मुझे अपनी जान की इतनी फिक्र नहीं है जितना कि तुम्हारी चच्ची जान और बहनों की है। अगर फौज वाले दस दराजी पर उतर आए तो सारी ज़िंदगी का जीना बेकार हो जाएगा। मैंने उन्हें यकीन दिलाया कि इंशाअल्लाह ऐसी कोई बात नहीं हुई। इमदाद मुझे अलहदा कमरे में ले गया। कहने लगा, शाहिद भाई, ज़िंदगी की सुबह ना हुई थी कि शाम हो गई। मुझे मौत सामने नज़र आ रही है और मैं मरने के लिए तैयार हूँ। मैंने सबकी ढारस बंधाई और दिलासा दिया। मैं दिल ही दिल में सोच रहा था कि क्या कुछ हो सकता है और क्या कुछ किया जा सकता है। मुझे यकीन था कि मैं मगरबी पाकिस्तान बल्कि लाहौरी होने की हैसियत से सब घर वालों की जान और इज्जत की हिफाजत कर सकूंगा। اپنی جان سے زیادہ مجھے اس وقت سب گھر والوں کی جان پیاری تھی. یہ سوچ کر مغرب کی نماز پڑھی اور اللہ تعالیٰ سے دعا کی کہ مجھے صبر و ہمت عطا کرے اور اس امتحان میں پورا اتارے. نماز پڑھ کے آیا تو دیکھا کہ امداد اپنی بہنوں کے ساتھ نماز پڑھ رہا ہے. وہ خود ہی امامت کر رہا تھا. نماز ختم ہوئی تو سب کے ہاتھ دعا کے لیے اٹھ گئے. آہ کیسا روح پرور منظر تھا. اتنے میں ایک اور افواہ اڑی کہ ملٹری کے پاس اسلحہ ختم ہو گیا ہے اور سب فوجی جو ادھر آ رہے تھے کیمپ کی طرف بھاگ رہے ہیں. بعد میں معلوم ہوا کہ وہ افواہ غلط ہے. فوجی مصلحتاً کیمپ میں چلے گئے ہیں, اصل صورتحال کا علم نہ ہو سکا. 29 مارچ 1971. مسلسل ذہنی کھچاؤ کے زیر اثر رہنے کی وجہ سے اب کچھ اچھا نہیں لگتا, حتیٰ کہ ڈائری لکھنے کو بھی دل نہیں چاہتا. آج صبح غیر یقینی سی صورتحال تھی. طرح طرح کی افواہیں اڑ رہی تھیں. صبح ایک افواہ سننے میں آئی کہ ای پی آر اور پولیس نے مل کر ملٹری کو ختم کر دیا ہے اور شہر ای پی آر والوں کے قبضے میں ہے. خبریں سن رہا تھا کہ ایک آدمی آیا اور کہنے لگا تھانے سے اطلاع آئی ہے کہ وہ لوگ ہر اس شخص کو جو بندوق چلانا جانتا ہے بلا رہے ہیں اور بندوقیں تقسیم کر رہے ہیں. اس کے تھوڑی دیر بعد مالی خبر لایا کہ پولیس لائن میں سب سپاہی مارے گئے ہیں اور ان کی لاشیں بے گورو کفن پڑی ہیں. لوگ رائفلیں لے کر بھاگ رہے ہیں. ایک اور افواہ یہ بھی آئی کہ جیل سے تمام قیدی بھاگ نکلے ہیں. مالی کی بات پر کسی نے یقین نہ کیا, لیکن تھوڑی دیر بعد اس کی تصدیق ہو گئی کہ پولیس لائن پر گولہ باری کر کے اسے مکمل طور پر تباہ کر دیا گیا ہے اور بہت سے سپاہی مارے گئے ہیں. اس ڈر سے کہ ہم لوگ میدان جنگ کے بیچ میں نہ آ جائیں, خندقیں کھودنے کا فیصلہ کیا گیا. پچھلی جنگ کا تجربہ کام آیا. سن 65 کی جنگ میں میں ہندوستان کی سرحد کے قریب رہتا تھا. لڑائی جنگلوں میں بی آر کینال پر ہوئی تھی, جو پاکستان منٹ میں میرے گھر سے بس 6 میل دور تھی. صبح سے کوئی اعلان نہیں ہوا تھا, اس لیے کرفیو کے بارے میں غیر یقینی سی صورت تھی. نظام خبر لایا کہ آرمی نے بھی خندقیں کھود لی ہیں اور آس پاس کے علاقے میں جھونپڑیوں کو آگ لگا دی ہے. ان کی تعداد بھی کم نہیں ہے, اس کے اندازے کے مطابق 1000 ہوگی. اس کے علاوہ ریڈیو اسٹیشن بھی ان کے قبضے میں ہے. ڈھاکہ ریڈیو اسٹیشن دوپہر کو البتہ اچانک بند ہو گیا. شام کو آل انڈیا ریڈیو نے خبر دی کہ ڈھاکہ ریڈیو اسٹیشن پر لوگوں نے حملہ کر دیا ہے اور خون ریز جنگ ہو رہی ہے. ڈھاکہ آنے کے بعد پتہ چلا کہ یہ آل انڈیا کی من گھڑت خبر تھی. ریڈیو اسٹیشن بجلی فیل ہونے کی وجہ سے بند ہوا تھا. بی بی سی کے نمائندے نے خدشہ ظاہر کیا ہے کہ شیخ مجیب کے گرفتار ہو جانے کی خبر صحیح ہے. آج سارا دن 10-12 فائر ہوئے. راجشاہی کی ای پی آر کی بغاوت کی جو خبریں آ رہی تھیں وہ جھوٹی ثابت ہوئیں. ای پی آر ابھی تک فوج کے ساتھ ہے. گھر کی یاد کبھی کبھی آتی ہے, لیکن گھر جانے کا کوئی راستہ نظر نہیں آتا. مستقبل کی طرف نظر کرتا ہوں تو تاریخ نظر آتا ہے. 30 مارچ 1971. زندگی اور موت کی کشمکش میں ہر لمحہ غیر یقینی کے عالم میں گزر رہا ہے. کبھی کبھی تو موت کے قدموں کی چاپ اتنی نزدیک آ جاتی ہے کہ کان سننے لگتے ہیں. آزاد فوج کے علاوہ چور ڈاکو وغیرہ جو آج سب جیل سے فرار ہو گئے, اور ان سب سے زیادہ سب سے بڑا دشمن جو ہمیشہ ساتھ رہتا ہے اور سائے سے بھی نزدیک, پیٹ, بھوک. اگر یہی حالات رہے تو بہت جلد لوگ فاقہ مرنے لگیں گے. آج صبح آنکھ کھلی تو خوفناک, مہیب اور اذیت ناک حقائق کا ایک ریلا دماغ میں گھس آیا. گویا دماغ کی کھڑکی کھلنے کا ہی انتظار کر رہا تھا. خواب بھی ڈراؤنے تھے لیکن پھر بھی خواب تھے. دیکھا تو کلام صاحب آئے بیٹھے ہیں. کلام صاحب انشورنس کمپنی کے افسر ہیں. فوراً حالات حاضرہ پر بحث شروع ہو گئی. وہ کچھ تو قدرتی امید پرست واقع ہوئے ہیں اور کچھ مصلحتاً بن جاتے ہیں. ان کے خیال میں یہ لوگ یعنی آرمی والے زیادہ دن تک نہیں لڑ سکیں گے اور آخرکار انہیں ہتھیار ڈالنا پڑیں گے. آل انڈیا ریڈیو کی خبروں سے معلوم ہوا کہ چٹاگانگ, جیسور, کوملہ, راجشاہی, دیناج پور سب آزاد فوج کے قبضے میں ہیں. آل انڈیا ریڈیو پر لوگوں کو یقین ویسے ہی کم ہے, لیکن ان حالات میں تو کوئی اس کی سچائی پر اعتبار کرنے کے لیے راضی نہیں تھا. راجشاہی پر گو آرمی کا تسلط بھی قائم نہیں, لیکن یہ آزاد فوج کے قبضے میں بھی نہیں ہے. البتہ اس بات میں کوئی شک نہیں کہ راجشاہی کے مختلف اضلاع میں فوج کی حالت بہت خراب ہے اور جہاں جہاں ضرورت ہے فوج گولہ باری کر رہی ہے. 2 ہوائی جہاز صبح صبح راجشاہی پر پرواز کر گئے. چند ایک دکانیں اور آفس وغیرہ جو کرفیو اٹھ جانے سے کھل گئے تھے, ان ہوائی جہازوں کو دیکھ کر بند ہو گئے. رکشوں, تانگوں پر اور پیدل لوگوں کے قافلے شہر سے گاؤں کی طرف روانہ ہیں. آج معلوم ہوا کہ پولیس لائن پر جو گولہ باری کی گئی تھی اس میں ان گنت پولیس والے ہلاک ہوئے. जिनमें से 17 की लाशें पाई गईं। उन्हें जनाजा पढ़ाकर दफन कर दिया गया। उतने ही लोगों को फौज गिरफ्तार करके ले गई, बाद में डिप्टी कमिश्नर की सिफारिश पर छोड़ दिया। दोपहर को खबर आई कि राजशाही के एक कस्बे पर आज़ाद फौज का कब्जा है और अब वो राजशाही की तरफ बढ़ रही है। पुलिस और ईपीआर भी इनके साथ है। आर्मी ने अब शहर में रेडियो स्टेशन, टेलीग्राफ, टेलीफोन और पावर हाउस के अलावा बाकी जगहों पर पहरा देना छोड़ दिया है। इनका मोराल काफ़ी बुलंद मालूम होता है। अनाज के एक गोदाम को अपने कब्जे में लेकर उन्होंने अपनी पोजीशन और मुस्तहकम कर ली है। चंद अफवाहों के जरिए ये भी मालूम हुआ कि पबना में फ़ौज की हालत बिल्कुल अबतर है और ख्याल है कि बहुत जल्द पबना पर आज़ाद फ़ौज का कब्जा हो जाएगा। शाम को ऑल इंडिया रेडियो से खबर मिली कि यूनिवर्सिटी पर बमबारी हुई है। अंदाज़ा है कि 50 के करीब यूनिवर्सिटी प्रोफेसर मारे गए हैं। अस्पताल पर भी बमबारी की गई है। ऑस्ट्रेलिया रेडियो से ये भी खबर मिली कि जनरल टिक्का खान जख्मी होने के बाद मारे गए हैं। इस वक्त ऑल इंडिया रेडियो से जो खबरें नशर हो रही हैं उनमें इस वक्त ये खबर नशर हो रही है कि ढाका कैंटोनमेंट और एयरपोर्ट पर कब्जा करने के लिए ज़बरदस्त लड़ाई जारी है। हिंदुस्तान अपनी पूरी कोशिश कर रहा है कि इस मौके से पूरा फ़ायदा उठा सके। रेड क्रॉस का एक जहाज़ कल ढाका पहुंचने वाला है। आज चचा जान थाने से अपनी दोनों राइफलें ले आए, लेकिन सुना है कि आज ऐलान किया गया है कि वापस करनी पड़ेगी। सुबह खातूब आया तो कहने लगा कि इसके 2 साथी मारे गए हैं, इसलिए वो पहले नहीं आ सका। हालात इतने गैर यकीनी हैं कि कुछ कहा नहीं जा सकता कि कल क्या होगा। दोनों फरीक हर हिम्मत पर फतह हासिल करने की कोशिश करेंगे और नतीजा, ज़िंदगी जब इतनी सस्ती हो जाए तो उसकी कोई कीमत नहीं रहती। सारा दिन अफवाहें सुनते सुनते ये हालत हो जाती है कि जहन की रगों में मज़ीद खिंचाव की ताकत नहीं रहती। शाम होने से पहले ही सर में दर्द होने लगता है।
शुक्रिया तैमूर। अब हफ्सा बात करेंगी।
So, can you all hear me? Just a trigger warning before I begin with my presentation. It will have mentions of sexual violence and rape. As part of my graduate school studies, I focus on the question of violence during the war of 1971, and which is an aspect of the war that is not unfamiliar to most of us. However, I concentrated solely on the violence by the Pakistan Army, and so I turn to the question of why was that violence committed? Why did this violence entail the specific forms that it took? How did we come to exercise such ferocity on people who were otherwise our own? And I shifted this to an equally crucial but more narrowed inquiry, which was that why did we decide to quell the uprising of 1971 through the use of sexual violence? And I interrogated this by tracing and exploring the self-imagination of the Pakistan Army and the masculinities which were at play during the war specifically. My starting point for this was the martial race theory, which was within the British Indian Army, and as a colonial category, it had many implications, not just for the recruitment patterns, but also for the sort of gender dichotomies and racialized dichotomies it fostered within the native population. So for those who don't know, the martial race theory was a colonial category that emerged out of 1857. We all know about the rebellion of 1857, and this was an exercise of the political construction of gender by the empire in India. What the British did after 1857 was that they designated those who had rebelled against them as men who were effeminate, and those who had sided with them as the masculine, manly men of India. Included in this category of masculine, manly men in the martial races were predominantly the Punjabis and the Pashtuns. And on the other end, we had the Bengalis. So one of the things that I think we need to pay attention to, first of all, is that the martial race theory not only divided people on the basis of this category of masculinity and effeminacy, but it also created this gendered hierarchy between them, which is important. Because number one over here, what we see is that the Punjabis and the Pashtuns were not just the martial races, they were considered markedly superior than the Bengalis. there was a lot of literature that was produced to support, the idea that the Punjabis and the Pashtuns were superior and were more martial, were more manly than, for example, the Bengalis. There was a lot of emphasis on climate, on landscape. A lot of it was, racial science or racism. So, again, another thing is that the trope of the effeminate Bengali existed in the British colonial imagination since a very long time. But it was amplified in comparison to the martial races. And over here, I think the focus is more on the Bengali Babu. Because the Bengali Babu was basically the stereotype that came to be associated with a Bengali man who had received English education and who was engaged in clerical and administrative professions and who was nationalist in his political orientations. So the Bengali, this trope of the effeminate Bengali now shifted into the trope of the effeminate Bengali Babu. And the Bengali Babu was consistently contrasted with the manly, the courageous Pashtuns and the Punjabis specifically. These masculinities were constitutive of one another. They were very, they were inherently relational. And again, it can be deduced that these gender dichotomies, what happened in between them was that the Punjabi and the Pathan were placed in it, and they were, among the native population, the most martial, the most manly men. And those who occupied the lowest rung in this were the Bengali Babus, or the Bengalis. And again, the peak of this hierarchy of masculinity was occupied by the supreme imperial British white man. However, when we're talking about this hierarchy, there were segmentations within this hierarchy too. Because the Punjabis were considered as ideal martial soldiers, as the ideal of native martial masculinity. Throughout colonial documents and reports that at least I studied, there is a lot of emphasis on how the Punjabi is the superior native martial man. And so while the British white man occupied the highest place, the native martial races followed them, and the Bengalis hung on to the bottom rung of it. So the Punjabis, again, at this point, were at the prime position of this martial masculinity, this gender dichotomy, and this hierarchy that was created between the native population. This racialized and gendered contrast, actually, now the contrast it developed was between the sword-wielding, the intrepid, manly Punjabis and Pathans, and the pen-holding, effete and effeminate Bengalis. And there was this institutionalization of this theory within the British Indian Army, so much so that it started to privilege the recruitment of these martial races in areas that were quote-unquote non-martial. And by 1929, 62% of the British Indian Army was composed of Punjabis. So as the myth of the martial races was institutionalized and heightened, so too was the image of the martial Punjabi man as this exemplary soldier who was without even a shred of the effeminacy quintessentially present in the Bengali. Now that is the colonial context of these, masculinities. However, I think it is important when we're examining 1971 to also shift, to the Pakistani army. We already know that it was the institutional successor of the British Indian Army. And of course, it inherited a lot of the conceptions and assumptions about masculinity and about the feminine Bengali. But my contention and my intervention over here is that all of these conceptions were not just, the fact that this composed the self-imagination of the Pakistani army. This was not just a product of colonial inheritance, but it was actively reinvented by the Pakistani army in a very nationalist framework. And I located the adaptations and the alterations to these assumptions about the Bengalis by focusing primarily on the memoirs, the books, the autobiographies of major figures in the Pakistan Army who had participated in 1971 or who were major figures before 1971. And my work here, it spanned the time from Ayub onwards to General Niazi, to Khadim Hussain Raza, Rauf Irman Ali, Brigadier Abdul Rahman Siddiqui, so on and so forth. I focused a lot on Ayub because, sure, while he did not take part in the war, his reign, directly preceded 1971. And a lot of the themes about Bengalis which were found in his diaries and in his autobiography were actually reflected in the other books of other army figures. So some of the themes that I at least, deduced and found in them was, number one, a very strong belief in the martial race theory and the fact and a very strong belief in a lack of masculinity among the Bengalis. This was also actually used as an excuse to justify the exclusion of Bengalis from the Pakistan army. Because while the Bengalis constituted the majority of the Pakistani population, even till the very end, they constituted no more than 9 to 13% of the Pakistan army. And again, because the Pakistan army was the successor of the British Indian army, there was a lot of dominance of Punjabis and Pashtuns in our army already. In addition to this, there were various racist stereotypes that were found in these books about Bengalis. Some of them I can only mention in passing because of the limitation of time, but some of them had to do with the fact that the Bengalis are treacherous, they're unreliable, they're irrational, they're attention seekers, they're psychologically inferior, they're emotional, their minds are shut off to reason, and they're full of skepticism. And a lot of these army figures, including Ayub, they attributed this to things such as geography and climate, which echoed colonial paternalism and racial science. So there was this pathological profile that was constructed of the Bengalis in these books by these figures within our army. However, this demonization of the Bengalis was given a more pernicious strain because they were reinvented in a nationalist framework using the two-nation theory. And the Bengalis were otherized. How was that done? That was done by portraying the Bengalis to be inadequately Muslim and so partially Pakistani. They were constantly portrayed as a people who were under the pull of their Hindu pasts, who were easily manipulated by Hindus, and who were very, very Hinduized themselves, even though the majority of them were Muslims. So any assertion of Bengali culture was seen as an attempt to revert to Hindu pasts and Hindu cultures by the Bengalis in front of our army. In fact, Ayub Khan in May 1967 wrote that the Bengalis are consciously Hinduizing the language and culture. Tagore has become their god. Everything has been Bengalized, even the plate numbers on vehicles are in Bengali. Consciously or unconsciously, they are moving towards separation and exposing themselves to absorption by Hinduism. We already know that the Rabindra Sangeet was banned actually on Radio Pakistan. And so there was this very thinly veiled contempt for Bengali culture, rituals, dress, dance, everything. Apart from this, their Muslimness was consistently doubted. Anthony Mascarenhas, who was one of the journalists who was flown to Dhaka in a carefully curated tour to show that normalcy had returned over there, and who eventually wrote that explosive article that the Pakistan Army was committing genocide in East Pakistan, is said to have, he's written this, that there was this absurd integration of the piety of the Muslims in the East Wing by those in the West. And this is a very common thing, that the Bengalis were considered inadequately Muslim, or not really Muslim. And even Ayub writes, and other army members write, that they're essentially Hindu with sprinkles of Islam in their culture. They're not really Muslim. And other times there's also assumptions about the fact that they have an affinity for India. And these are things, bear in mind, that these are being said much before 1971. This is during the 1960s. Hindus were blamed for manipulating Bengalis. However, Bengali Muslims, this did not provide any relief to them, because they were consistently portrayed as being Hinduized themselves. So the lines between them were, constantly blurred. One of the incidents that really caught my eye while I was researching was that in 1952, and this is way back, the Punjabi governor of East Bengal, Malik Feroz Khan Loon, is reported to have remarked that the Bengalis were half Muslims and accused them of not bothering to halal their chickens. The insult provoked a counterblast from Maulana Bhashani, who replied, "Happy to lift our lungis to prove that we are Muslims." And this is in 1952. So this demonization and dehumanization and otherizations of Bengalis eventually led to the growing conviction in the idea that the Bengalis had to be saved from themselves and Pakistan had to be saved from the Bengalis. This otherization easily allowed and seeped into its next stage, which labeled the Bengalis as disloyal and unfaithful citizens, which happened as early as 1967, when the law minister branded Bengalis as traitors, and Ayub actually agreed with him and said that that is exactly the language they should be spoken, in and with. And my argument is that it was the fusion of these burgeoning and harmful colonialist and nationalist myths regarding the Bengalis in Pakistan, which collectively forged their demonization, dehumanization, and otherization, which was ultimately weaponized for the violence of 1971, and which was particularly enacted on the bodies of Bengali women. According to feminist scholars, gendered violence during war is a product of militarized hegemonic masculinity, which arguably is structurally embedded in pre-conflict gender inequality and unequal power relations. I draw from the work of Raven Connell and Nicola Henry to propose that the masculinity during 1971 can also be understood through the gender and historical prism of relational and racial hierarchies of masculinity and effeminacy between Punjabis, Pathan, and Bengali men. Gendered violence was the performance of militarized masculinity in 1971, whose opposite was effeminacy. The gendered and hierarchical relations between men of different martial and non-martial races were central in making the bodies of Bengali women a patriarchal extension of the battlefield upon which masculinities and nationalisms could be contested. Brigadier A.R. Siddiqui, Abdurrahman Siddiqui, who was heading the ISPR at that time, wrote a book in which there was a lot to unpack, but I'll only be referring to a couple of the quotes. He recalls remarks by Brigadier Jilani at the staff conference before the military operation, which stressed the need for psychological warfare in East Pakistan to bridge their cultural alienation from West Pakistan, for which all Hindu features of Bengali culture must be erased. Similarly, Brigadier Siddiqui acknowledges that the operation had begun as a limited punitive operation designed to punish a handful of miscreants, but that it had quickly developed into a regular anti-Bengali military campaign, during which stories of extensive killings and rapes floated in the air like leaves in autumn. This is, by the way, something that's written by a Pakistani brigadier. And I know that there's a lot of contention when we talk about the history of East Pakistan. There's a lot of people who say that, people have agendas when they say all of these things, but one does not need to look far. You can visit the books of Pakistani generals and officials and army members just to locate all of these assumptions and to critically see the mindset with which the Pakistani army went into East Pakistan. Women's bodies were the corporeal side, where the other could be most closely located. It represented and contained and maintained Bengali culture. It was the nucleus of the Bengali family and society and the reservoir of national identity and honor. And it possessed the capacity to furnish and replicate all of this by reproducing their race. The Bengali woman, in many ways, embodied the future Bangladesh. The fixation of Bengali culture as a corrupted and contaminated body of Hindu, anti-national influences, fit for cleansing and eradication, cannot be isolated from the gendered violence, whose extreme violence and forms targeted the most vulnerable population of the Bengali community. However, even as Hindus were blamed for the trouble in then East Pakistan, it did not bring, again, any relief to the Bengali Muslims, because the lines had been blurred much long before. They had been condemned as traitors who were under complete Hindu domination psychologically and culturally. Thus, they were practically, perceived as Pakistan's Hindu enemies. Brigadier A.R. Siddiqui similarly recalls that the campaign was not just a temporary mission of pacification, but one of conversion and transformation of the Bengalis into true Muslims and Pakistanis. In General Rahim's opinion, who was also a top-ranking general in 1971, until such a time that the Bengalis persisted in holding on to their Hindu mindset, as evident in their script, their dress, their love for Tagore, and other Hindu intellectuals, there was little hope of them ever becoming good Pakistanis. Another incident that has to do right, before the Operation Searchlight in East Pakistan was when Yahya Khan actually visited Dhaka. And on the sidelines of the airport, a lot of Bengalis had congregated. And he looked at the journalists and he told them that the solution to the crisis was ki pehle inko Musalman karo. That was by Yahya Khan, and that was right before Operation Searchlight. So this discourse of doubt towards Bengali Muslims and their Muslimness and their inferiority was not uncommon. In fact, Bengali men were often demanded to remove their lungis in 1971 by Pakistani soldiers in order to inspect whether they were circumcised or not, to prove whether they were Muslims. This otherization of the Bengalis was also rendered complete in rendering them the enemies of Pakistan. The Mahmood Rahman Commission recorded Raw Farman Ali's testimony that Tikka Khan had told the troops, "What have I been hearing about shortage of rations? Are there not any cows and goats in this country? This is enemy territory. Get what you want. This is what we used to do in Burma." The appointment of Tikka Khan, who was otherwise known as the Butcher of Balochistan, I think was already indicative of what was going to happen in East Pakistan. Almost identically, in his first address to the military officers after taking command, General Niazi is also said to have declared that the Bengalis were to be treated as enemies. Khadim Hussain Raja, who actually was one of the architects of Operation Searchlight, recounts in his book two very jarring incidents, which actually again reveal the mindset with which the Pakistani army, and at least its top-ranking generals conducted the war. Upon assuming command, General Niazi visited the operations room, and I'm quoting Khadim Hussain Raja over here, where he after one point started raging and raving, "मैं इस कौम की नस्ल बदल दूंगा, ये मुझे क्या समझते हैं?" His openly hateful language for the Bengalis is appalling on several fronts. It reflects the total otherization and dehumanization of the Bengalis, the detachment and distance this dehumanization had created from the Bengalis as Pakistani citizens, the conception of Bengalis as a separate race, racially inferior and despicable, and finally, it makes a ghastly and undeniable warning of gender repercussions, hinting at violent racial and demographic change. Similarly, Khadim Hussain Raja recalls handing charge to Major General Rahim Khan, and then meeting Niazi, who immediately told him, "ये लड़ाई वड़ाई की फिक्र नहीं करो, वो तो हम कर लेंगे, अभी तो मुझे अपनी बंगाली गर्लफ्रेंड्स के फ़ोन नंबर दे दो." This is in Khadim Hussain Raja's book. While this can be considered a flippant comment, it must be placed within the wider context of Niazi's character. The Hamoud Rahman Commission registered the ill repute of General Niazi in what was vaguely termed sex matters, and referenced the testimony of a witness who stated, "The troops used to say that when the commander himself is a rapist, how could they be stopped?" Niazi's exchange with Raja reads as an expectation of sexual license, access and liberty which could be taken with Bengali women by Pakistani military officers during this opportune time of turmoil. He is said to have openly encouraged the Jawans in their unsoldierly and inhuman and carnal indulgences. "What is your last night's score, Shera?" is what he would ask them. The score referred to the number of women the soldier might have molested the night before. Niazi is also reported to have argued brazenly in justification of rape cases reported to him, infamously remarking, "You cannot expect a man to live, fight and die in East Pakistan and go to jail for sex, would you?" It was with this attitude and orientation, facetious at best and disgracefully frightful at worst, with which Niazi approached and directed Pakistan's military operation against the Bengalis. In fact, in front of the Hamoud Rahman Commission, he admitted that there were a few cases of rape, but asserted that the guilty persons were duly punished, and that these things do happen when the troops are spread over. One of the things that really caught me off guard when I was researching and reading through the books of these generals was that you would expect that they would not acknowledge the issue of rape cases in East Pakistan, but they actually do. The scale was so huge, you simply could not just, ignore it. They do acknowledge that rape cases occurred, but a lot of them actually tend to sort of explain it, and that explanation kind of extends onto a justification that these were the outcomes of the natural, impulses of the soldiers. That, sexual violence is just a natural outcome of all these soldiers who were so far away from home and had nothing better to do. It was an inevitably natural fulfillment or result of soldiers' sexual needs during wartime. But this obfuscates the distinction between sexual contact and sexual violence while justifying the latter. They also admit that they turned Nelson's eye to a lot of rape cases during the war. The fact that they portray rape cases as inescapable consequences of war and an unstoppable result of soldiers' sexual needs, which is especially kosher during war against enemy, it demonstrates a negligent attitude at best and a permissive attitude at worst. Again, these are things that one does not need to look far in order to locate. I concentrated on these remarks and comments and ideas and beliefs of Pakistan's top-ranking generals and officials who participated in 1971, specifically General Niazi, whose words and personal actions even the Hamoud Rahman Commission found as an encouragement of violence and rapes, to be indicative of the atmosphere and the currency of a particular discourse during the war in the Pakistan Army about sexual and gendered violence. In disagreement with the insistence of Pakistani military officials and generals on their explanation of wartime rape as the natural result of soldiers' sexual needs, I press upon Ruth Seyfried's exposition that sexual violence is an extreme act of violence perpetrated by sexual means, and which I extend to say that it was in line actually with the military goals of that war and that operation. More crucially, it was an expression of the power of the racial and martial masculinity they had been historically invested with, by colonial categorization, which is emboldened and bolstered by Pakistani nationalism, and against the Bengalis who represented racial and gender difference and inferiority. As a conclusion to my, the work that I did, I turned to the work of Nayanika Mukherjee, who has also, done a lot of work on the women who suffered during the war. Nayanika Mukherjee supplies us with the vital nuance that while the notion of power is intrinsic to the process of sexual violation, a focus on power alone does not reveal the complex intersections between sexuality and the state in relation to masculinity, which is why it is necessary for us to examine the discourses and intertextuality and citationality of the various forces of history, politics and identity which give day to these violent encounters. And it is precisely this persuasion which propelled my focus on the martial race theory as the starting point of my interrogation regarding why Bengali women were specifically made targets of sexual and gendered violence by the Pakistani army in 1971. I historicized the martial race theory and the colonial politics and construction of gender which undergirded it. Belief in racial masculinity and racial effeminacy reviled and denounced the Bengalis as a downtrodden and cowardly class of people who were intrinsically and fundamentally incompatible with the army and also with courage. In addition to the embrace of this colonial inheritance, the reinvention, exaggeration, and dissemination of racist tropes against the state of Pakistan's nationalist ideologies condemned Bengalis not just racially but also culturally and religiously. Growing conviction in this definition of difference essentially spelled that the Bengalis must be saved from themselves and Pakistan must be saved from Hinduization, for which, and I'm quoting Ayub here, rivers of blood will flow if need be unhappily. Although sexual violence is an aggressive expression of power, Mukherjee reminds us that power alone does not emerge and operate in a vacuum. It is constituted by a complex web of intersections and interactions, which I have attempted to probe and locate. It is equally crucial to situate that power as an endowment of specific pre-existing historical and institutional constructions pertaining to the polarities between the superior and martial Punjabis and Pathans, and the inferior and ephemeral Bengalis who were racially, culturally, and religiously contaminating Pakistan in its purity and unity. Therefore, I step towards the conclusion by emphasizing that the reality of war is not just politics by any other means, but politics incarnate. Politics written on and experienced through the thinking, feeling bodies of men and women. And so the politics of violence during 1971 must also be understood as consequentially being the politics of race, gender, and sexuality, which sexual and gendered violence was a militarized performance of, an embodiment of particular imaginations, iterations, and hierarchies of race, masculinity, and nationalism, which were consciously, willfully, and ferociously enacted on the bodies of Bengali women. Some of the questions that I've faced after doing this research work during my graduate school is that why am I asking this question? What is my interest in it? The why of violence. And I think there are a couple of things that I can offer in regards to this. Bangladesh has consistently asked Pakistan to render an apology for 1971. I think as recent as last year, perhaps, if not this year. And Pakistan has refused to do that. The most we've offered them is an expression of regrets, which was offered by Musharraf during early 2000s. Ravina Sehgal wrote that Bangladesh becomes a gaping hole in national memory. The only way to speak about it is through silence. They can be erased from consciousness. This is precisely what the textbooks do. They erase Bangladesh by not telling the tale. There are many ways of not telling. One of them is to tell a different story, to speak half the truth. The story of Bangladesh is silence between half-truths and full lies. If ever speech is used to create silences, it happens in the case of Bangladesh. One-liners and short phrases in Bangladesh at the end of chapters cover up oceans of unspoken horrors. I base the backdrop of my research in my positionality as a Pakistani woman and as a Punjabi woman. Because I personally believe that a person's, a scholar's politics cannot be as neatly separated from their scholarship as we would like to pretend that it does. I believe that my position made it even more pressing for me to pursue the urgent and ethical responsibility of questioning the history that was taught to me, and to critically investigate it and to reckon with the histories that were hidden by it. Pakistan civil society organizations such as the Women's Action Forum actually broke through state-imposed narratives to render an apology to Bangladeshi women quite a while ago. And my work too was a part of this aspiration of further opening and deepening these cracks and crevices in the state-imposed half-truths and fabrications. We know that any attempt at deviation from the state-sanctioned narrative, and the remembrance and the creation of Bangladesh does not escape or slip through the Pakistani state's surveillance and censorship. The cancellation of the conference in March is one of the most recent examples of it. And yet here we are, holding another event. So why is it important for us to remember 1971? And what is so threatening about remembering? Remembrance and memory are threatening because the past undoubtedly continues to be a battleground in Pakistan's present. And remembrance becomes a challenge only when there is a monopoly of memory. And that is the case in Pakistan, especially when it comes to 1971. I would go as far as to say that history is much like a mirror, or perhaps historical memory is like a mirror. No one would like to take look in the mirror and see something that they simply cannot bear. There is then the need to make the vision in the mirror more bearable and acceptable. And for that, there is a need to monopolize how you see what you see. And I understand that that is extremely painful. It is jarring to confront what you cannot look at. But it is necessary for us to do that as students and as citizens. In my classes, one of the questions that often confronted me was that, why study about 1971 now? What is the need? It's been so long, Bangladesh has been created. And I mean, one of the main answers I offer them is that it is because history offers us the lessons that we can learn today. And because it allows us to see that there were possibilities in the past for things to have been better, for things to have gone another way, and that there is a possibility today for things to be made better still. The politics of memory and the monopoly of historical memory does not make them historical truths. And these monopolies naturalize history as an inevitability, as if 1971 was just supposed to happen because, you know, India was there, because all of these conspiracies were taking place. And this naturalization of history as an inevitability denies us the power to make or change history. And this is the power that the remembrance of history beyond state-sanctioned narratives gives back to us. The corners, margins, and constructed silences of monopolized history speak more loudly than one can imagine if we are only to listen to it. And 1971, at the end of the day, is our history, it is our inheritance, and it is for us to honestly and earnestly recognize and own in all its tragedy, but also its responsibility, and the many horrors whose stains we find on our hands. We owe this to ourselves and also to the Bangladeshis, who once shared in the dream of a Pakistan with us, and only by remembering can we see that. To remember is a right, to remember is to resist the enforced silences, to remember is to refuse the monopoly of memory. Because on the rare occasions when it is remembered, 1971 in Pakistan is carefully curated as a debacle, as a tragedy, as a betrayal. But the question that stares us right in the eye is that who betrayed who? And the answer to that is painful and clear. It is ours to face and ours to bear. Lastly, we must remember 1971 because the past isn't really dead, especially in Pakistan. The past isn't really dead, its afterlife is the present. From Gilgit-Baltistan to Gwadar, the issues of ethnic movements, of movements for autonomy, of equal rights and justice, of hegemony, of violence by the state, are not questions of history in Pakistan. They are the now. And it is for us to do better than we did in the past, but that we can only do only if we truthfully remember the past itself.
Thank you. Anam, could I ask you, if that's okay,
Yeah.
Sara? So Anam will be speaking to us about some of the testimonies that she collected in the course of her book project. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Hafsa and Taimoor. Those are incredibly difficult to listen to, but also critical and so important. So thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who's brought us together today. So I'm going to be reading a couple of testimonies that I collected during the research for this book. The first one is from Bangladesh, and it's Professor Meghna Kohatakurta. And also trigger warning because it has a lot of mention of violence. 3 men, an officer and 2 sepoys barged in from the back door, pushing our maid to the side, demanding, "Professor Sahib kahan hai?" When my mother asked why, the officer said, "Unko le jayenge." Can you hear me okay? Is it static? The officer said, "Unko le jayenge." My mother asked, "Kahan le jayenge?" He repeated, "Bas le jayenge." It was the night of 25th March when Meghna, then only 15 years old, had been woken up by her father, a provost at the Jagannath Hall, a non-Muslim residence hall at Dhaka University. It was the night Operation Searchlight was launched, the Pakistan Army's action to crush the secessionist movement in East Pakistan. Dhaka University, whose students were actively engaged in the resistance movement against Pakistan, would be one of the primary targets. The operation would unfold into a long and bloody war, finally culminating in Pakistan's surrender on 16 December 1971 and the birth of Bangladesh. There was a lot of firing that night, but we had assumed that it was because the Dhaka University students were excited and eager to show their spirit to Zulfikar Bhutto, who was in town. By then, the firing had become a regular occurrence, Meghna told me. Our flat was opposite Jagannath Hall, overlooking the Shahid Minar, the monument for the martyrs of the language movement of 1952. In fact, we were the center of all things that were going on, she said. referring to how Dhaka University was one of the major centers of political activity, right from when the language movement started to the 1970s. We even went to see Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's speech on 7th March, held at the Ramna racecourse. And I remember my father kept saying, I don't see any mediation. I don't know what will happen. He feared that the army would clamp down because there was no way they would let things continue as they were. The radios were broadcasting their own programs in Bangla. There were marches happening. There was an active civil disobedience movement. But even then, my father thought the army clampdown would just involve forcing students to stop protesting and return to the university, or at most translate into the arrest of teachers who the state thought were instigating trouble. We could have never imagined what happened. But even before the events of March 1971, Jagannath Hall and Meghna's father had been caught in a disturbance. She told me that the trouble had started as early on as January or February of that year. Just opposite Jagannath Hall was the National Cadet College, where the army trained young students for parades and things like that. So they had their headquarters there, and army officers were posted there. Now there was this big break, a big gap in the wall of the university. She told me that the army would enter through this gap to march along. It wasn't a big deal. They would just say attention and all that. But by now, the civil disobedience movement was going on, and most of the students had gone off. Some of them, though, had stayed back, especially the poor students and the Hindu students had stayed back in the hostels to earn extra money through tuition. These students decided to complain that the marches were disturbing their lessons, their exam preparation. You have to understand, the students' blood was boiling by this time. Things had stirred up politically. And so one day these students decided to take some cement and bricks and block the break in the wall so that the army couldn't enter. And then they shouted a slogan. They said, Jai Bangla, Jai Sindh. This was a common slogan at that time. However, when a complaint was registered by the army headquarters, they noted that the students were shouting Jai Hind instead of Jai Sindh. As Meghna spoke, I could only imagine the repercussions. Given the anti-Hindu sentiments in the country, and the fact that the nationalist movement in East Pakistan was commonly understood as an Indian conspiracy perpetuated by Hindu intellectuals and teachers in East Pakistan, the sloganeering, that too from students belonging to a quote-unquote Hindu hostel, was not going to go down easy with the state. It would only serve to reinforce the prevalent beliefs of Hindu disloyalty and of Pakistani Hindus being anti-state and pro-enemy, that is pro-Hind or pro-India. In the process, genuine grievances and the long struggle for rights and equal treatment would come to be sidelined in favor of simplistic narratives. By brushing over the events preceding 1971 and focusing on the rhetoric of Indian conspiracy and Hindu treachery, Bangladesh should come to be seen as an illegitimate achievement in Pakistan, a loss difficult to accept. After that incident, we all feared that Jagannath Hall would be targeted, Meghna continued. It wasn't long before this happened. On 25th March, when the Pakistan Army entered Dhaka University, the hall and its provost, Taimoor Shahid, Meghna's father, would face the brunt of the action. I was sleeping when my father woke me up and asked me to go lie down on the floor in the other room. We could hear shots being fired. He assumed that it was the students at Dhaka University, eager to show their spirit to Bhutto who was in town. By now, Sheikh Mujib had called for people to be prepared with whatever they had. And so whenever night came, students would parade with their arms, shooting something or the other with hunting rifles. But this night, the noise was just too much. I remember my mother peeked out of the window and saw a convoy of army jeeps enter the campus. She turned to us and said, "The army has come." Even then we thought that all they would do was take away the rifles and force the students back to their classes, or arrest the professors at the most. And so when they entered our home, my mother went to get my father. He was going to be arrested, we thought. She handed him his Punjabi and told him, "They have come to take you." Both Meghna and her mother believed that Jyotirmoy would return in a few days, so much so that when they saw the family of Professor Muniruzzaman, a professor of statistics who lived in the same building as the Gohatakurtas, refusing to let go of Muniruzzaman, Meghna's mother assured them, "Look, let them take him away. They have taken my husband too. They will shoot you if you don't. If you resist, they will shoot." Meghna told me that she and her mother had thought they would call up their friends who had connections and held powerful positions. They were confident that their friends would help get Professor out, and a professor and others like him out. I rushed to call my friends, whoever I thought could help, Meghna said. And that's when I found out that the phone line was dead. I noticed the dread creeping into her voice. The fact that the phone connection had snapped indicated that things were far worse than they had imagined, shattering the hope that her family had held on to until then. It was going to be one of the darkest nights of their lives. Suddenly we heard shots and ran outside, finding Munir Zaman and the others lying in a pool of blood. The women and their family were trying to get them to drink water. One of the women told my mother, "They have also shot your husband. I gave him water, he's calling your name." In the moment, the entire world collapsed around me. My body trembled as I sat beside Meghna, observing her narrate those horrific memories with such composure. She told me that she had repeated the story many times. I feel like it's my duty. Meghna added that she wanted to play her part in ensuring that the historical reality she lived through were documented. Like so many others in Bangladesh, she wanted to archive these histories so that the struggles of the people, the memories of the war, one that took away so much from her, aren't forgotten. We took a pitcher of water and ran out the back door, finding my father lying on his back. He was conscious. He said, the army asked my name, and then they asked me my religion. I said, I'm a Hindu. After that, they gave the order to shoot me. One of the bullets had pierced his waist, leaving him paralyzed, while the other had punctured his neck. That, Meghna took in a deep breath before continuing, the only moment she stole for herself in the middle of the narration. That was a critical injury. By then, other people from the building came down and helped us carry him across all the bodies and the blood back to our house. The medical hospital was just opposite the road, but we couldn't take him there because of the curfew. The army was patrolling. So we just sat with him, my mother trying to calm him down and stop the bleeding, all through that night, all through the next day, and the next night. He lay there like that. It was only on the 27th morning, when the curfew was lifted, that we were able to take him to the hospital. A few days later, on 30th March, Taimoor succumbed to his injury, leaving Meghna and her mother grief-stricken and displaced for the months to come. For the remaining part of the year, they would go from one friend's house to another, often taking refuge in hospitals and orphanages to save their lives. But when I asked her if she or her mother ever wished that her family, like so many other Hindu families that had moved to India during or after partition, too should have made the move, given what it cost her family, she shook her head. We were born here. This is our desh, our ancestral land. My father used to say that one does not leave one's country. She paused to reflect for a moment and then said, my mother and he both were teachers. They were married in 1948. They loved what they did. They enjoyed a vibrant social and cultural life in Dhaka. People would gather around them, reciting poetry, putting up plays. My mother and my father, like so many others in the intellectual circles, didn't really believe in partition, but they didn't also mind it. They thought that if Pakistan was for everyone, they were very happy to be Pakistanis. They didn't have anything against Pakistan until Pakistan had something against them, she laughed. Long before his death, Taimoor was targeted by the state, like many other Hindus. He was put on the enemy list, blacklisted during President Ayub Khan's regime. Hindus who held high posts were blacklisted as Indian agents. My father's radio broadcast, which included book reviews, talks on literature, etc., was prohibited until Ayub Khan stepped down. When my father inquired, he was told he had been blacklisted because of a poem that he had written as a young man, praising Subhash Chandra Bose. In fact, when he returned after completing his PhD from England in 1967 and submitted his passport for renewal, they never returned it to him. It was always stopped from Islamabad. Yet, Taimoor refused to leave. This was home for them, Meghna said, reflecting on her parents' choice. There's no regret in her voice. The difficult history of her nation and her family has settled with her as the only truth. According to official Bangladeshi history and in people's memories, the night of 25th March, when Meghna's father was shot, is imprinted as the beginning of a gruesome war. It was a night that Bangladeshi history would be written from. It was the night that would serve as a constant reminder of the brutality of the Pakistani forces, etched into textbooks, walls, and museums of Bangladesh even today. It was the night into which all the struggles of East Pakistanis, 1947 onwards, against the discrimination and hostility that they had experienced from West Pakistan would converge. As many Bangladeshis put it, there was no going back after 25th March 1971. As the army operation began, the fate of Pakistan and of Bangladesh was sealed. The following day, on March 26, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman declared independence. That day has ever since been marked as Bangladesh's Independence Day. By the end of that year, the subcontinent was once again divided, leaving one nation rejoicing its newfound independence and the other mulling its loss. I'm just going to read one other oral history that I collected in Pakistan of the Punjabi poet Ahmed Salim, and I think this one is important to share because it is narratives like these that remind us that there are still oral histories and personal memories and conversations like these that can help us move beyond the status narratives that we find in museums and textbooks in and around us, and in the most recent movies and documentaries being released this month. In 1971, I was 26 years old. I had become involved with the Communist Party of Pakistan and the National Awami Party, NAP. The NAP had a policy of parliamentary democracy and standing up for people's rights. Though we had contested against the Awami League in the elections, when we lost in East Pakistan, our president, Khan Abdul Wali Khan, as a matter of principle said we should support the Bengali cause. He said that they had the absolute majority and should form the government. So as a political principle, we were supporting Bangladesh. In 1971, when this incident happened in March, referring to the army operation, one of our leaders, Naseem Shamim Malik, returned from Dhaka the next day and told me how the killing had started in front of her and how her Bengali friends had asked her to go back to West Pakistan. They said she was at risk there. Every last Sunday of March, we used to celebrate the festival of Shah Hussain, Mela Charaga. We used to go to his mazar and perform Bhangra. That day I said Shah Hussein's madhus were being killed in Bangladesh, and so we should go barefoot with bare heads and tell Shah Hussain that his friends in Bangladesh were being killed. This was a poetic expression for me. And then I wrote a poem on this, Sada Jeeve Bangladesh, Long Live Bangladesh. The poem, which I'd written in Punjabi, was translated into Urdu and published. After that, my warrants were issued. So you were already referring to East Pakistan as Bangladesh? I asked Salim. Surprised, because I know that the Pakistan I have grown up in, such an act can be construed as anti-state. But he told me that in all his writings, he had long referred to each province by the names the people of that land associated with it. Long before NWFP was named Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in 2010, Ahmed Salim had already called it Pashtunkhwa. Similarly, the Bengalis had adopted Bangladesh. I think that had Pakistan stayed united, it is likely that East Pakistan would have come to be referred to as the Bangladeshi province. If the Awami League had been allowed to form the government, they would have been in majority and might have been able to get a resolution passed in the assembly to rename East Pakistan. So I felt that Bangladesh was the identity and titled the poem as such. But of course, the government found the title provocative. When Salim appeared for his trial, he was as courageous as he had been in writing that poem. As a young man in his 20s, he seemed to have little fear. When the magistrate, who was a major, accusingly asked him, "You are Punjabi, and despite that you have written against a Punjabi army?" Salim responded, "A murderer is neither a Punjabi nor a Pathan. A murderer is a murderer." Later, when the magistrate insulted the poem by calling it Khatiya, Salim told him that while he may call it anti-Pakistan, the title of Khatiya or Bariya could only be given by a literary person. If someone with poetic authority tells me my poem isn't at the level of good poetry, I will listen, but you are not a poet. Needless to say, a harsh punishment was given to him for committing quote-unquote treason. He was released from jail after the war was over in January 1972. Back home, his family was distressed. My mother was really angry with me. My sister was about to get married and my arrest was a setback. A friend of mine helped out by giving my family some money and telling them I had deposited the amount with him for my sister's marriage. It was through this lie that they were a little pacified. Upon his arrest, his niece asked her mother why the police were taking away her uncle. Her mother told her, "Your uncle wrote a poem against Yahya Khan." Confused, the child, who was only 4 years old, asked, "So what? Yahya Khan can write a poem against uncle. Why does he have to arrest him?" The reality was that at that time, I couldn't think about myself, he said, the things that were happening. Years later, when he was awarded the Friends of Liberation War honor in Bangladesh, he asked why this was being bestowed upon him. I had only written a poem and spoken up a little. They told me that if 10 people talk a little standing amidst 10 crore people, there's nothing more courageous than that. They said that Bangladesh was attacked. We Bengalis had no option but to fight. But you did so of your own will, and we want to appreciate that spirit. And I think they were right. Our leaders, 2 or 3 women such as Sara and esteemed, who were part of the Anjuman Jamhuriyat Pasand Khawateen, all supported the Bengalis in 1971. Once in the month of April, we were marching on the streets of Lahore when the shopkeepers spat on us, calling us anti-Pakistan, telling us we should be ashamed. The women were also with us. The shopkeepers spat on Taira too, and she tolerated it. That was the character and spirit at that time. We thought that a party, the Awami League, has an absolute majority and you're trying to beat them down? What kind of democracy is that? Here, Salim added that there were only a few people standing with them. This was only a tiny movement. Iski koi haisiyat nahi thi. Iski haisiyat, iski moral strength thi. If the population was 10 crore here at that time, there were not even 10,000 supporters, if we estimate generously. We could count them on our fingers. That day before I left, I told Salim that I was in awe of his spirit, as a Punjabi, as somebody who grew up in a society where Bengalis were looked down upon, where they were said to be influenced by the Indian, the quote-unquote Hindu culture. It couldn't have been easy to escape popular sentiment. While most people in West Pakistan stayed quiet, either because they were afraid or because they had bought into the state narratives, how had he as a Punjabi defied the popular sentiment? It didn't take him long to respond. He smiled and said, "Only a true Punjabi can be ready to help other patriots. An anti-Punjabi would never want to help others. It is only because I'm a true Punjabi and because Punjabism is to help others. I write in my mother tongue. I'm a Punjabi poet. I love Punjabi, so I love all languages. Had I not been a conscious Punjabi, I too would have said, like the other Punjabis, that Bengalis were traitors." While the war of 1971 is often remembered as a war between the Punjabis and the Bengalis, here was a Punjabi who felt that it was only because he was a true Punjabi that he could stand up for the Bengalis. It was because he loved his own language so much that he could understand the importance of Bengali for his fellow countrymen. It was his Punjabiness that had made him defiant. Here the Punjabi and Bengali had stood as one, fighting for the same cause on both sides of Pakistan. And it was only when Bangladesh found its independence that Salim too was emancipated from the shackles of his confinement. On a wintry day in January, about a month after the war ended, Salim walked free. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move on to poetry, fiction, and song. I'll first ask Sara Kazmi, and then we will end with Taimoor Shahid again. I'm sorry, I know we're over time, but I hope it's well worth your while. Sara?
ਸਾਡੇ ਦੇਸ਼ 'ਚ ਮੌਜਾਂ ਹੀ ਮੌਜਾਂ, ਚਾਰੇ ਪਾਸੇ ਫੌਜਾਂ ਹੀ ਫੌਜਾਂ, ਲੱਖਾਂ ਬੰਦੇ ਕੈਦੀ ਹੋ ਕੇ ਅੱਧਾ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਮੁਲਕ ਗਵਾ। ਵਾਹ ਬਈ ਵਾਹ ਜਨਰਲ ਜ਼ਿਆ, ਕੌਣ ਕਹੇ ਤੈਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਜਾ। So I will be sharing a few poems by Ustad Daman, who was an anti-colonial poet from Lahore, an anti-colonial Punjabi poet, and another Punjabi who loved Punjabi and Punjabi so much that he understood it as a kind of terrain for enacting solidarity with other struggles, anti-colonial struggles, anti-oppression struggles, and Bangladesh being one of them. So this particular poem, as the latter part of it tells you, is actually written during the Zia dictatorship, and it is in response to the Zia dictatorship. But Daman is referencing Bangladesh kind of to have that kind of subversive renewal of memory, and that subversive reminder that, of course, the Zia regime, like other military regimes in this country, has tried to erase and completely invisibilize. So in this kind of very tongue-in-cheek, ironic, and frankly kind of really witty poem, I think there is a lot of kind of historical unpacking and also a particular kind of critique authoritarianism and of the tyranny of the ruling elite and of military dictatorship in Pakistan. So just by way of a little bit about Ustad Daman, who's not from that classic canon of celebrated progressive or communist poets that we associate with the Taraqi-Pasand writing tradition in South Asia. So he was actually Mia Iftikharuddin's tailor, who was just really good with verses, and Mia Iftikharuddin was a noted progressive and communist in colonial India. Just took him along once to a rally that the Indian National Congress had organized in Lahore, which is where Daman lived and wrote for all his life. And that's how his poetic career kind of started. And I think his critique of the military's excesses in Bangladesh and of military dictatorship is very formatively grounded in his anti-colonial politics, because he was first and foremost committed to a critique of colonialism and then the practices of internal colonialism under the Pakistani state. So, to share a few verses by Daman today is just to illustrate how he kind of routed very regional, vernacular Punjabi poetic forms. So because he uses a lot of folk language, he uses a lot of everyday Punjabi idiom in his work, and to show how something as specific as his Punjabi identity, which of course in the kind of machinations of the ruling elite has become a dominant oppressive force, can also be used as an articulation of a Punjabi progressive sensibility or a Punjabi sensibility of professing and extending solidarity to those who are being oppressed by the Punjabi elite in this case. So overcoming dominant Punjabi identity to extend allyship across other lines, either of class or caste in his case, because he was also he's also done a lot of anti-caste poetry, and of course in this case this is regional kind of ethnic identity. So the next and just another thought I had is also about how Daman, unlike Faiz and also even unlike Ahmed Salim in that way, is not a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. He's also not part of, like I said earlier, that kind of particular elite of the intelligentsia. And in a sense, his poetry is entirely kind of published posthumously, so he used to share it via recitation. And I think what the existence of this kind of poetry also tells us about popular cultures of critique, and sort of very popular and everyday and I would say critiques of what happened in Bangladesh and the excesses of the Pakistani establishment in Bangladesh from below. In very kind of, he used to hang out mostly at the thada and have chai, and so it was a very different political scene from which these poems are also emerging. So the other one the next one I'd like to share with you guys is directly, Pakistan the ajab hai wand hoi. Pakistan the ajab hai wand hoi. Thoda is paase, thoda us paase. Ki enna jaraha ilaj karna. मरहम इस पासे थोड़ा उस पासे असा मंजिल मकसूद ते पहुंचना की टांगा इस पासे ते घोड़ा उस पासे ऐथे गैरत दा की निशान दिसे जुड़ा इस पासे जुड़ा उस पासे. So again, I was thinking of these lines when you were speaking, Hafsa, and in the sense that the construction of a particular kind of Punjabi masculinity and that being kind of associated with the ideology of the military, and then it extending into expressing itself and manifesting itself as sexual violence directed at Bengali women. And just the use of the word gairat here by Daman, and him questioning that, and I think just the idea of the wand, which is how in Punjab you refer to the partition of 1947. So how I think we need to think about 1971 as also not just an event in the past that needs to be commemorated or remembered, but as a certain logic of dominant historiography or of hegemony as well, which is there is a bordering exercise that happens, and then there is a bordering logic that was set into place first in 47 and then strengthened again in 71, which is still unfolding, which is the border that you not only actually create between, sort of on a territorial scale, but between the other and the self, the Muslim and the not so Muslim, and actually just Hindu, right? The border that you create between Urdu as the appropriate national language, Bengali as not the national language, as an enemy language. And in fact, Punjabi also had a similar status. So Punjabi poets were branded traitors and Sikh sympathizers and thrown in jail, and Daman himself was actually jailed by every single regime, including Bhutto's, because he had something to say about everyone. So I think this poem, which is talking about the Ajab Vand, thoda es paase, thoda us paase, and then how those destinies are still entwined in so many ways. That's kind of what I felt about this one. The third one, this is actually written as a maya, which is a folk form and also folk song genre. So, Sunja Jandya Jandya Rahia, Sunja Jandya Jandya Rahia, Gaya Ayub, te phas gaya Yaya, Band ne kam, te gao paye maya, Jio mere dhol sipaiya. So I think we all know that when he's saying Jio mere dhol sipaiya, that the irony is just leaping off the page. And the very important thing again is that in a time when everything, including our songs and our languages and our poetry, our history is just being absorbed and transformed into different avenues of propaganda for the state. So when Noor Jahan sings Puttar Hatate Nahi Vikde, and there is no kind of love for the Punjabi language that you would see, say, on PTV as much, or even, so why is it that at that point there are all these tropes from the popular traditions that are marshaled, in this case, to support a kind of militarized, masculine expression of the Pakistani state's ideology. And what Daman here does is he actually takes the Mahiya and he takes a song which is traditionally associated with the genealogy of, like, with the Sipahi and the soldier returning home, and actually flips it on its head to talk about Ayub and Yahya, and talk about the kind of corruption and tyranny of the military ruling elite. Sunja Jandya Jandya Rahia, Gaya Ayub, te phas gaya Yahya, Bhand ne kam, te gao Mahya, Jio meria dhol sipaiya. The last one that I'm sharing, and actually I also, I was so glad that you spoke about Ahmed Salim and you shared his testimony, because I was earlier on the phone with him trying to get a copy of that poem, because I have an English translation. And also it's another example of how he uses Madhu Lal Hussain, like the kind of like the patron saint of Lahore, to talk about Bangladesh. But I think Ahmed Salim, as an important kind of supporter and you know, ally of the Bangladesh struggle, I'm glad he was represented today. So this is Mere Mulk de Do Khuda. Mere Mulk de Do Khuda. La ilaha te mashallah. मेरे मुल्क दे दो खुदा ला इलाह ते माशाअल्लाह एक रहिंदा है अर्शां उत्ते दूजा रहिंदा फर्शां उत्ते ओदा नां है अल्लाह मियां एदा नां है जनरल ज़िया वाह भाई वाह जनरल ज़िया वाह भाई वाह so again really witty and again we're also laughing but अगर गौर करें कि मेरे मुल्क के दो खुदा so in a sense the very premise of the two nation theory which I think was also discussed today and the kind of ideological foundations on which a lot of violence has been enacted upon not just the Bangladeshi population, but Baloch populations, Pashtun populations, and even I would say working class populations in Punjab and elsewhere, is that he's kind of almost making a blasphemous assertion right there, saying do khuda. You can't have two khudas, right, in the land of the pure, you shouldn't. But by the end of the poem, we're quite clear that who is the farshope or the real khuda. As far as life in this Pakistan goes. So, to conclude, I think the reason I wanted to share some verses by Ustad Daman today is also so that sitting in Lahore, in his hometown, where he started reciting his poetry, where he relentlessly throughout his life first opposed colonial rule, then military rule under Ayub and Yahya, then Bhutto's authoritarianism, all the way until his death in, I think within weeks of his actually, and they were very good friends as well. To just connect with a kind of progressive Punjabi culture, which allows us and in fact enables us, in fact compels us to resist, to critique, to question ourselves, to acknowledge our complicity, and to actually stand with those who are most oppressed today, and also to probably begin answering the all-important question of what is to be done. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, last but not the least, we have Taimoor Shahid. He'll be sharing his recording of Bangla songs and much of the sites. So over to you, Ahmed. Light agar aap band kar dein, to acha ho jayega.
Thank you everyone, and thank you all of you for sharing all these difficult but wonderful things. Just a bit of context, the piece I read was from a diary of a student also from Lahore, not Punjabi technically, but studying in Dhaka University in 71, and he was taking a daily diary throughout his stay there, and then war happened, and these are the episodes from the diary. And he was with a Bengali friend in their family and living in disguise as a Bengali and went to the Indian refugee camp and back. So this is an excerpt from the diary which was published but of course not distributed. It was published in serialized episodes in Masawat, which I showed you the photo of. But anyway, so this is an excerpt from that. And the next three pieces are recordings, archival recordings of Jadiyan, which are songs from Maiman Singh, which is in northwest Bangladesh. These are traditional folk songs of lamentation for Karbala, but they are mixed with the local Indic characteristics, which I think some of which is threatening to the misunderstood Punjabiness here. And those are recordings that my friend Mausumi Bhumik, from Calcutta, did. And I mean, here I want to say a bit about like the context of all of these pieces is that, and I think that element is important to remember, is that they've all come about. I mean, I'm not a scholar of this time period or not a scholar of any of this stuff, but to me all of this is very personal. The piece that you will hear came out of my friendship with Mausumi, whom I met in Calcutta, where I had gone to study Bangla for something else. And through that friendship, we started talking about borders, and then we came up with some idea of collaboration. So these are her recordings, and then there's my readings from the same diary that I translated. Similarly, the piece after that is an excerpt from a contemporary Bangladeshi novelist who wrote a novella called Pakistan in Bengali and faced a lot of flack in Bangladesh itself. But it was recently translated into English by another of my friends from Calcutta, and both of them asked me to write a foreword to it because they wanted to do a whole subcontinent thing, because that novel is a very unique take on the idea of friendship and the possibilities that can even exist now, and what it means to go beyond the histories of trauma and internalized hatred. And similarly, the last piece, a very short 2-minute poem, which I again wrote on literally randomly encountering a Pakistani, me and encountering an Indian and a Bangladeshi on the street and becoming very, very close friends with them. I think without much ado, I can just begin this. This is a recorded piece, so I don't need to be on the mic.
Rajshahi, 1971. The next day I went to see the Naik from Sialkot. He was not there, but I met some other soldiers who stopped me until his arrival. All of them were different from him, both in temperament and outlook. They appeared to be enjoying their lives, joking around. They boasted about their deeds to me. It was a game of fire and blood, and their eyes sparkled with joy as they talked about it. They are cowards. When we go to their villages, all of them run away except for the old hags, claimed one of them with arrogance. Meanwhile, an old man came there, coughing. He was perhaps a Bihari, otherwise he couldn't have entered that place so fearlessly. He knew one of the soldiers and had come to request him to ask the Wapda officials to restore electricity supply to his house. The old man stayed there for some time and participated frankly in the conversation. At one point, when the conversation turned upon the subject of treachery, the respectable-looking old man, commenting on the nature of Bengalis, said, "The Bengalis are born slaves, and they will always remain so. Look, no king was ever born among them, nor a wrestler, and not even a saint. They are disgraceful people. It serves them right." It shocked and saddened me deeply to hear this. I wanted to reply to him, but stopped myself and remained silent. By this time, my Naik friend had also returned. I saw restlessness in his deep eyes, but perhaps he also knew how to be patient. I begged my leave from him after the old man left. Tea is ready. Please have a cup, he said. I couldn't ignore. He had asked me with so much love. I went straight to the hospital to visit Bilal. He was all right. He would be able to go home after they removed his stitches. The doctors told me that they had admitted some rape victims to the hospital, and some of them were in serious condition. Returning from the hospital, I decided to take a different route, the one by the road beside the riverbank. But as soon as I arrived there on a cycle rickshaw, I heard a voice asking us to halt. I advised the rickshaw peddler to stop. Two Bihari boys digging roadside trenches had asked us to stop. Behind them, through the bushes, I saw the face of a Punjabi soldier. Instead of asking the boys why they had stopped us, I turned towards the soldier and asked him in Punjabi what the matter was. When the boys heard me speak Punjabi, they were scared and asked me with a hint of apology to go ahead. In the meantime, the soldier rushed to the road and asked who was talking in Punjabi. I introduced myself to him. He welcomed me warmly to his bunker, which was stationed behind the bushes. He was a soldier of the Pakistan Army, a Havaldar by rank. He had a blank, stern face with small eyes. He started talking to me about himself. He had flown in from West Pakistan a week ago. They had reached Nagarmadi from Dhaka on a steamer and from there to Rajshahi by a coach. These Biharis tell us that they have collected so much booty that it will be sufficient to cater for all their needs for the next 3 years, he told me enviously. I asked him if the people had stopped coming from across the river. Yes, we don't let anyone come from that side, he replied. I asked him about the inhabitants of the Pakistani villages across the stream. He was amazed at my statement and told me that there was no Pakistani village there. Those are the villages of Bengalis, he explained, and the Bihari boys affirmed with a nod. It was now my turn to be stunned at what he had said. I explained to him that Pakistan's territory extended to a very distant point in the riverbed. There were many Pakistani villages of Bengalis loyal to the country. He was quite surprised to hear that and said, "These people have told us something different." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 4 young men with their hands tied behind them. Some soldiers had arrested them near another bunker. One of the young men was crying endlessly. I asked him who he was and why he was crying. He told me that he was a clerk in Baghdad and he had nothing to do with politics and that he was innocent. I translated for the Havaldar whatever the young man had told me and asked him to let the boys go. What else could I do? The Havaldar listened to me sympathetically. However, he dispatched them away in a soldier's custody with instructions for handing them over to a major. I was getting late, so I took my leave. The next day I had to be in the hospital early in the morning. When I reached there, I found Bilal sitting on the bed. He could even walk now. I asked him to rest for some time and excuse me for visiting Ward 3 to see the wounded children admitted there. I had thought of visiting them several times earlier, but every time I had failed to gather the courage and strength to do so. I was not sure if I would be able to get a hold of myself coming across children writhing in pain, but they had recovered now and were about to be discharged, I had learned. When I entered the child ward, I stopped for a moment and glanced across it. All the children were less than 10 years old. These innocent little souls were lying on hospital beds, wrapped in bandages instead of jumping around in some park. Terrified, their faces were devoid of peace. It seemed as if they had forgotten to smile. All of them had cut wounds on their throats. They had survived attempted slaughter. I talked to a little kid called Wasim. Who tried to hurt you? I asked him. Hindus, he replied. What did they do? They knocked me down and slaughtered me. His face was expressionless as he blurted this horror, as though it was nothing extraordinary. He told me that all his siblings had been killed, his mother had been kidnapped, and that his father had gone to Bogra looking for her. What does your father do? He is a guard in the railway, the boy replied. His eyes were blank, but mine filled with tears. I couldn't ask him anything anymore. I saw a miserable-looking mother on a nearby bed. Son, what do you ask me of my living? She said despondently when I talked to her. Only 3 out of my 9 children have survived. She pointed to her 3 kids who had emaciated into skeletons. Wrapped in bandages, 2 of them were lying in bed on both her sides. They were looking at me strangely, as if I was the beast who had devoured their brothers and sisters. A little girl was sitting close to them. She had a lovely, innocent-looking face that reminded me of my younger sisters. My heart cried. The woman told me her story as tears rolled down her eyes. My son, she said, we were prepared to defend ourselves. We knew that they were going to eliminate us, so we were ready to fight to the last drop of our blood. Even I learned to use the slingshot, but they tricked us. They assured us that nobody would be hurt and thus unarmed us, and then they started the slaughter. Their father was a storekeeper at Mymensingh University. He was on leave and had come home to stay with us. They killed him first. I had a young daughter. I had educated her at home up to the 10th grade. She fought bravely like her father, and they could only get her dead body. They slaughtered all my children. They also hit me on the head, and I fell unconscious, presuming that we are all dead, they went away. The Pakistan army salvaged us from amongst the dead bodies.
So there are two more pieces. I think I can, it's up to you. There's a short poem that I'll end with. It's just a 2-minute piece with some music. But before that, this is the excerpt from the novel about friendship, and it's a 10-minute reading. If you are up for it, I can read that or skip it. हिम्मत है? सुनना है? तो सुनेंगे? नहीं सुना तो कोई बात? जी? ठीक है. This is the cover of that novel. It was recently published. So my friend Raza, who translated it, also in the images, a lot of images are from personal archives. The diary that I read from and the translations which these were from, it's actually my father's diary. So the images are from that, and then there's some artwork that I did with another friend. Again, relationship of personal involvement in the 71 episode. And these are some letters to my father. Karachi, 1987. The Aeroflot plane that was taking us to Moscow stopped first at Delhi airport. We got off the plane, roamed around in the transit lounge, had tea or coffee, and thus walked while away an hour. After that, the plane took off, and in an hour or so it landed again, this time at Karachi airport. But we weren't permitted to get down now. An airline official announced, passengers must remain seated on their respective seats. We will take off again in an hour once the necessary cleaning of the airplane is complete. My seat was next to the window. Looking out, I saw some soldiers surrounding our plane. They had automatic weapons in their hands. Their weapons were pointed at us. Without really being conscious of it, I found myself muttering, "Bloody sons of marauders." The Soviet military aggression had not yet ended then, and so it was quite normal on the part of Pakistanis to point their guns towards the Aeroflot aircraft. After all, it was the Soviet Union that struck the last nail on the coffin of Pakistan, and the Soviet aeroplane had come from Dhaka, carrying mostly Bengali passengers. I was 6 years old in 1971. I was in my grandfather's village then. There weren't really any roads to travel to and from the village, which was very far from the sub-divisional district headquarter towns. The Pakistani army couldn't go to that village, or they didn't go for whatever reason. And so I had never seen with my own eyes what they looked like. Seeing them for the first time on the 17th of August 1987, at the age of 21, before I knew it, I muttered profanities. After that, one of our fellow passengers, a youth from Bogra, walked back from the direction of the toilet, wiping his hands with tissue paper, and said with a smile on his face, "I went and shat on that fucking Punjabi's head." I thought to myself then that each one of us ought to do something or the other to express our hatred towards them. Thus begins the contemporary Bangladeshi writer Mashiul Alam's story titled Pakistan, translated into English by V. Ramaswamy in Calcutta. It tells the story of a Bangladeshi's reluctant encounter and subsequent friendship with a Pakistani Punjabi or Hanadarir Bachara, bloody son of a marauder, as the protagonist calls all Punjabis, whom he first hates but then becomes friends with. The story reminded me of one famous Hanadarir Bacha or bloody son of a marauder and what he once wrote in a poem in Urdu. In Taza Khudaon mein bada sabse watan hai. The greatest of all new deities is the nation. In fact, this bloody son of a marauder is also mentioned by name in the story, and one that the protagonist does not like without even knowing anything about him. This is the great poet Iqbal, the national poet of Pakistan, who of course died well before the creation of the nation deities of Bangladesh, Pakistan and India. A complex historical figure in his ever-changing chimerical thoughts, politics and deception, one of his diagnoses of the modern colonial condition, the nation-state as the greatest of all false deities, is echoed at the heart of Mashiul Alam's novella. Though called Pakistan, it is of course about the whole subcontinent, and the fundamental question at its heart is whether a nationalist can ever escape the straitjacket of nationalism. Can a citizen enchanted by the fresh spell cast by the modern deity of the nation-state be ever Manush, child of Manu, a progeny of Adam and Eve? Can a nationalist be ever human? The story explores these questions about nationalists becoming through a powerful, vivid narrative of the protagonist's encounter with a Pakistani called Imtiaz. Through the interactions of these young men in People's Friendship University in Moscow, the story peels the various layers of historical amnesias and nationalist narratives to construct radical possibilities of solidarity across the people of undivided subcontinent. It digs in the past to search for that shared regional commonality between the people of the subcontinent in many ways. It opens difficult conversations towards healing through various means, one of them being a jogging of our memory by turning back to a longer past, going past 1971, past 1947, past the birth of the three nations, and even past colonial times. In fact, it asks us to look at the wreckage of civilization in South Asia, not unlike Walter Benjamin's Engine of History, with its wings caught in the breeze of future as it stares helplessly at the piling wreckage of modern civilization. But in fact, it exhorts us to escape it by standing under the wreckage, to get to the bottom of it, to see where and how it began so we can defy the winds of barbaric progress and imagine new possibilities by learning from the possibilities that were, that could have been, and that could be. Through this effort, the story shows that it is possible to arrive at a point where a Bangladeshi, an Indian, and a Pakistani can toast to friendship between their nations, as do in a scene in the story proclaim, "Long live Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, long live friendship." Yet, the story carries the grain to go even beyond that, so much so that the toast can be read as, "To hell with Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, to hell with all boundaries and nation states, long live friendship." It shows that it is totally possible to imagine a politics where one is not pitted against another, where there are no losers and no winners, but all fighting siblings have a place in the mother's courtyard, as a character imagines Hindustan, that all siblings are its adornment and beauty. As Annie Césaire had once beautifully put it, there is room for everyone at the rendezvous of victory. Moscow, 1990. Imtiaz held out a glass towards Rupinder. She picked up a slice of bread, took a small bite, and accepted the glass with a sweet smile. She looked at me with fluttering eyes, and then she smiled radiantly looking at Imtiaz. He nodded his head in gracious invitation. After that, he made a toast in Russian to the sound of the clinking of the three glasses, the meaning of which was something like, "We drink to subcontinental solidarity." After a little while, Rupinder asked me, "Were you born in Dhaka?" "No, in another town." "And you?" I asked. "In Delhi," said Rupinder. "But my forebears arrived there from Pakistan. My father and Chacha were born in the town of Sialkot." "Sialkot," I exclaimed. "When we were kids, we played with footballs made in Sialkot." Imtiaz said, "Sialkot was once famous for making sports goods. Not just footballs, but cricket bats, badminton rackets, and lots of other things, all of very good quality. It was exported to Europe too." Rupinder said, "But of course I don't know about that at all." "I do. because it's a town in my country. In fact, my grandfather's house is in Sialkot. My father and Chacha were born there too, said Imtiaz. I smiled and said, so that means that your roots are in the same place? Both of them laughed. Rupinder said, Imtiaz's father and Chacha left Sialkot and settled in Lahore of their own free will. But my grandfather, father and Chacha had to leave Sialkot for fear of their lives. That's absolutely correct, said Imtiaz, nodding his head. There was silence for a while. After that, just as Rupinder was about to say something, Imtiaz said, but my father was compelled to leave Lahore and go to Karachi. Why? I asked. Imtiaz replied, I told you that when the paper my father worked for in 71 criticized the military crackdown in Dhaka that was launched on the night of 25th of March, the government proscribed the paper and sent my father and some of his co-workers to jail. What was my father to do after that, once he was released? He was without a job. He left for Karachi. He found a job there. Rupinder said, but the events of partition were far more terrifying than that. My grandparents, father and Chacha were forced to flee from Sialkot, risking their lives. They went first to Amritsar and then they settled down in Delhi. My grandpa had a two-story house in Sialkot where there was a garden in front of the house and another one behind it. The rear garden had a pier's tomb. Grandma used to light up a lamp at the pier's tomb every evening. She used to run to sit by it at the slightest adversity. 3 months after leaving Sialkot and arriving in Delhi, Grandma passed away. Grandpa too left 6 months later. December 16, 2021. There are numerous such stories that we all know of. We in the subcontinent are all uprooted, even those who have remained in place. When the garden is itself mutilated, can the nightingale that does not migrate be deemed rooted? The religious cosmopolitanism that was natural to Rupinder's grandmother and sounds so fantastical to us today was what we lost with the birth of the deity of nation. It was a cosmopolitanism whose patrons were saints and mystics and faqirs of all denominations and faiths, writing, singing and speaking in all languages of the subcontinent, from Sindhi to Bengali and from Kashmiri to Tamil. But when this garden of varied flowers and nightingales who spoke love in numerous tongues was chopped up, it began to wither and continues to do so. The nightingales were forced to speak one tongue and love one flower, and the garden was no more tended to by gardeners, but by sayyads, hunters, who imprisoned both flowers and nightingales. My 98-year-old grandfather in Karachi still cries to go to his mother's grave in Kasganj. My grandaunt in Karachi died crying for her home in Khidirpur, Calcutta, and my grandmother always missed her ennobled Ajmer Sharif, where she grew up in the shadow of the shrine of Khwaja Gharib Nawaz, the endower of the estranged and the poor, the patron saint she adored so much and under whose auspiciousness her Dalit butcher ancestors from Rajasthan became Muslims, but to whom her progeny has lost all connection after she migrated to Pakistan. Our uprootedness is so complete that we do not even feel uprooted. Such is the psychosis and blindness caused by the devil of nation state, and the task at hand is to undo it. It is hard, though not impossible. As Sheikh Al-Akbar, the Andalusian Sufi Ibn Arabi, once said, the darker the darkness, the easier it is to find light. And the light that this great saint, like all other saints of all denominations, always want us to find is inside our hearts. The seat of all, the seat of one, the seat of light divine, even if now buried deep under the darkness of pathological hatred fueled by the priests of nationalism. As that famous bard of Bengal, Gagan Harkara, sang, a song we must all sing and to whose exhortations we must act and act in unison so that we can find ourselves and thus find the Manush, the child of Manu, the progeny of Adam and Eve that we all are. Ami kothay pabutare, amar monir Manush jare. Where shall I find the one, the Manush who resides in my heart? Where indeed can we find the one buried deep inside our hearts? Enter the multi. On a serendipitous encounter of a Pakistani, an Indian, and a Bangladeshi in a small town of America. We ate words and witnessed miracles under a new moon. Apparitions saved us from violences of sanity. Our worlds enclosed by the mana of unbloomed magic We saw what is in us more than ourselves. Our belief in the abilities of finite thought drowned in the lake of a Midwestern town where we met Christ hung over booze. From pillars to post we ran in search of dreams stuck in brick holes of a decrepit hotel, like unremembered memories of facilities in Melbourne. The push and pull of distant waters of the Dhaka, Thatta and Chittagong echoed in rising winds, marvelous errors of clown-like gods who exiled us all in time's womb. We killed the gods who rose in us. We saw what is in us more than ourselves. Victorious, we emerged, and dead lay the carcasses